Hey, Jim.
Oh, good morning. It's Jim in Fern. Can you see me?
Yes, and we can see the wallpaper as well. What that Kristen did.
The very beautiful wallpaper, absolutely, yes. Got to have a good background for, yes.
It matches your jumper, Jim. I'm very impressed.
Thank you, it does. Yes, all very coordinated, yes.
Can we see yours? Or is that...
Oh, yes, in theory, yes.
Modern technology.
Janet's going to be teaching by
Sorry.
BC next year.
There we go.
Janet?
Get me in there.
Yeah, there we
Aha! That's better, yes. Good evening, all.
They're supposed to have a connection with Perth as well, but the CMOS isn't picking up, so I'm sure the student in Perth will call them themselves to try and get connected. It's not working.
It's recording.
And it is recorded.
Okay.
Right.
This is the latest in our intermittent series of public lectures, I think. We had one just before the Easter break, another drama one, so it's two drama ones in a row. This week it's Dr. Ulrich Pallua from the University of Innsbruck, who's come to talk to us about work connected to his current project on slavery. This is on 18th-century plays and slavery.
Exactly.
Very pleased to have you.
Well, thank you for having me.
Zoom in on you so people on the recording can actually see you. Sorry, I know it's encoded.
Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me. Well, I invited myself. But thank you for having me. And well, my talk today is about.
Hello, Lynn and Becky.
Hello.
Can you turn your microphone off?
Yes, can you turn your microphone off?
Oh.
Because we don't want to hear you.
Okay.
Oh, don't worry, we're teasing.
Ah.
There we go.
There we
That's
go.
good.
If we do that, we won't hear words.
Would you appear in shot to turn the
Hang on.
microphone off?
Hello, we can hear you, and I think you've got your microphone on. If you hover over where you did, there should be this little microphone button that you can press.
Can't ask questions.
But
Oh, that's just switched it on.
That seems to be it. Excellent. So if you got questions, by all means come back. We're not trying to kick you out, but just
if your microphone's on,
quieting
that's
you
what
down for a
happens.
little while. But nice to have you guys. Right. Sorry.
Okay, that's fine.
Up to you.
That's fine. Well, my talk is about African characters in selected plays from the abolition period, that's 1772 to 1838. And, well, the actual title is Wretches Designed to Beat Their Masters' Dogs and Lick Their Feet. This is a quotation from Thomas Southern's Oronoco from 1696. Well, so my talk is divided into an introduction, a short introduction. Then the second chapter is about the instrumentalization of the black body, and then in chapter 3 I'll talk about 3 plays from that period, and we will hear in a minute which plays I'm talking about. Okay, so first the introductory chapter. The study of 18th century literature, and that is novels, plays, poems, travelogues, newspapers, periodicals, pamphlets, caricatures, etc., has proved an invaluable source for identifying national images in regard to divergent characteristics associated with non-Britishness. So the stereotyping of us and them, the dissemination of auto and hetero stereotypes, forged not only a rhetoric of the British nation, but at the same time a rhetoric of the other nations. So the image of Britain as the leading nation among European powers, the cultivation of an image pitted against all that was other, served as a basis for the colonialist surge of solidarity and loyalty when it came to the distancing of us from them. According to Langford, the essence of the 18th century heterostereotypes, quote, was not so much that the English reasoned that they were superior to the others, but that it genuinely did not occur to them that any rational being could suppose they were anything else, unquote. So this positive self-evaluation or ethnocentricity legitimized the process of dividing humankind into ethnically or tribally distinct societies with different cultural patterns and values, with Britons priding themselves on being the nation that embodied the love of liberty. In his article, Historizing British Cultural Studies, Ansgar Nünning argues that the love of liberty of the British was, quote, the most prominent leitmotif in the discourse of patriotic xenophobia, which manifests itself most obviously in the contrast between freeborn Englishmen and foreign tyrants who enslave their subjects, unquote. So their apparently much-loved British liberty, and thus their loathing for oppression of any kind, the enslaving of human beings certainly included, nevertheless did not restrain them from materializing into the biggest trader in slaves across the Atlantic in the late 18th century. Why would a nation and its national literature that had put so much effort in the dissemination of Britain as a haven of liberty distort and violate its own image by tearing Africans from their homeland, transporting them to the colonies, and enslaving not only their bodies but also their minds? Interestingly enough, the love for liberty was used by both supporters and opponents of the slave trade and slavery in their argumentation for or against enslaving fellow human beings. According to Drescher, quote, abolitionist literature tended to emphasize African society as desperately requiring change, but hitherto imprisoned in the violence of the slave trade, unquote. So in the 2 centuries between the formation of the Company of the Royal Adventurers in 1660 and the abolition of slavery in the British Empire in 1834, slavery and the slave trade exerted a profound influence on British society and economy. This was reflected in the literary output as by 1834, quote, there existed a considerable body of literature concerned with slavery, abolition and emancipation, a body which included political tracts and pamphlets, newspapers and periodical reports, biography and autobiography, and novels, poems and plays, unquote. So according to Jeffrey and Cox, however, quote, few interested in depictions of slavery and abolition have felt the need to turn to the drama of the period. Even the revival of interest in the drama of the Romantic period has brought little attention to the staging of slavery, unquote. So even if the issue of slavery only gained momentum in the early 1770s with the Mansfield decision, plays like Thomas Southern's Oronoco, Mrs. Waddell's Inkle and Jericho, John Hawkesworth's and Francis Gentleman's Oronoco, as well as Isaac Bickerstaff's plays, among others, were particularly influential in shaping the representation of black Africans on stage. A regular London theatre-goer would have seen the depictions of African characters or of slavery during perhaps every season of the 18th and early 19th century. When it came to the actual performance, however, the Licensing Act of 1737 limited the possibility to put certain plays on stage, as performers were limited to Covent Garden and Drury Lane, with summer productions at the Haymarket. So all productions in these houses were regulated by the Office of the Chamberlain, who censored all new plays. In addition to these venues for legitimate theatre, the late 18th century also saw the proliferation of legitimate forms of entertainment that evaded the scrutiny of the Licensing Act by presenting musical entertainments or other forms of spectacle that did not rely on the spoken word of actors. And that, of course, also included the pantomime, which was a good form to basically evade the Chamberlain's office. Cipher corroborates the fact that there were numerous plays which featured an African character or characters that some of these naturally voice anti-slavery sentiment, but the crusading spirit is not in them as it is in poetry and fiction. So the challenge to be met is not whether plays featuring African characters explicitly supported and or refuted the slave trade and the enslaving of fellow human beings, but which images the representation of Africans created in the minds of the audience/readers. So it's not so much about the crusading spirit, which was certainly not the case in regard to fiction, since passages dealing with slavery were relatively marginal and thus did not influence the novel's overall impression. then about character tropes contrived to shape people's preconceived biased views of Africans. Since the anti-slave trade movement is the earliest benevolistic enterprise of national scope, this paper attempts to scrutinize the image or images of African slaves in three places from the abolition period. And that is Archibald McLaren's The Negro Slave from 1799, Joanna Bailey's Rainer, that is 1804, and Maria Edgeworth's The Two Guardians from 1817. The overall aim is to categorize the character of the African slave according to the different images conjured up in the individual place by placing particular emphasis on the national identity of the British Empire in creating alternate heterostereotypes whose frequent reiteration successfully familiarized the British public with the character of the non-familiar. From a post-colonial perspective, it will show how the stereotypical portrayal of African slaves was not only, quote, a matter of affixing certain psychological traits to a given nation or ethnic group, but also the attribution of certain actorial roles to a certain nationality within a narrative configuration, end of quote. The second chapter is entitled The Instrumentalization of the Black Body, Cultural and Biological Difference. The dichotomy between Europeans and non-Europeans rested on the assumption that, for example, Africans were different, other. Roxanne Wheeler contends that it was not about race, it was an issue of Christians versus non-Christians, heathens. Quote, to be a Christian was to be fully human, an association that reverberates throughout the 17th and 18th centuries in global confrontations. Unquote. Warman, however, contends that in the course of the 18th century, quote, the mutability of race no longer necessarily depended on religious conversion. Rather, religion was now often blended with or overshadowed by markers of cultural difference, such as custom, education, and level of civilization. Unquote. Clothing, for example, also played a decisive role, as dress stood in stark contrast to nakedness associated with savagery. It was supposed to reflect a person's quality of mind. Moreover, the so-called four stages theory of the cultural progress of mankind was crucial in determining the stage people were in. It characterized the most savage societies as those engaged in hunting, fishing, or shepherding activities, and the more polished societies as the ones that pursued agriculture and commerce. The climate theory, that is, climatic factors such as the sun, the heat, the wind, the fertility of soil, and the like, were all considered to influence the color of the skin and thus behavior and disposition. So climate theory was the secular rationale for various skin colors, behaviors, and abilities. John Miller and David Hume, for instance, furthered the cause of the, quote, unequal advancement and ability, unquote, of different nations, but at the same time also raised doubt about the climate theory, in particular David Hume in his Of National Characters. In his 1758 revision of the essay, he claims that he is, we all know that passage, quote, apt to suspect the Negroes and in general all the other species of men, for there are 4 or 5 different kinds, to be naturally inferior to the whites. There never was a civilized nation of any other complexion than white, nor even any individual eminent either in action or speculation, no ingenious manufacturers among them, no arts, no sciences, unquote. I disagree with Oldfield's suggestion that Wheeler seems to overemphasize the cultural context regarding the otherness of non-Europeans, since racial features in terms of cultural difference did in fact matter. So, according to V. Wolfka, quote, to speak of cultural racism is to insist on an image of racial difference which is not natural or biological, but contained in language, religion, tradition, national origin. It is to stress the fact that for the racist, the culture of the other, irreconcilable with his own, may constitute a threat to his cultural identity, unquote. So cultural identity already entails biological difference, as the physicality of the other was a distinguishing feature in the process of pitting us against them. So when attempting to come to terms with European or British attitudes towards the other, it's of vital importance to subject the negative connotations surrounding black and blackness in the images of African slaves to close scrutiny. So these attitudes towards black bodies provided the foundation for the categorization of an African identity, an identity divergent from what was perceived as the white European norm. Sanchez-Epler avers that, quote, if the body is an inescapable sign of identity, it's also an insecure and often illegible sign, unquote. Taking this assumption as a starting point, it's crucial to shed light on how British playwrights instrumentalized the insecurity and illegibility of the black body and forged a rhetoric of its inferiority. So denying black bodies the status of a person led to the strengthening of the mastery of the European over the African body as being annihilated. A person is owned, absorbed, and unnamed. So the absorption of the body resulted in the absorption and dissolution of an old and the creation of a new identity. And the so-formed collective identity of Britons was made to contrast markedly with the collective identity of African, with Britain thus providing the cultural benchmark against which African identity was assessed. Culture, quote, meant to cultivate or improve, but by the 1770s it had also taken the meaning to civilize. Enlightenment, epistemology, exploration, imperial expansion had brought this change in meaning, as in other keywords of the period, ranging from race, which went from denoting a breed or stock to one of the broad differences among humankind, to nation, which added to its older juridical and biblical concepts of a people, the idea of political territorial particularity, unquote. So the territorial distinctiveness of Britain, highlighting the anomaly of Africa, turned the encounter of the two nations into we, who owed a moral duty to civilize them, which was later to become an openly racist categorization of humanity into pseudo-scientifically preconceived races. What about knowledge about Africa, or knowledge of Africa? Knowledge about Africa was very limited, and there was little, if at all, first-hand experience that was used in the argumentation for or against the slave trade. According to Austin and Smith, quote, arguments presented in the slave trade debates had been framed in terms of the political situation in England rather than conditions in Africa, unquote. This is why both sides, that is pro and anti-slave trade supporters, in the slavery dispute build up pictures favorable to themselves. These pictures portrayed not the real Africa, but a pseudo-Africa inhabited by pseudo-Africans. Writers took the African character, typified it, and used it as a means to comment on the enslaving of human beings, either confirming the biased view of non-Europeans being wild and heathen beasts in need of civilization, or refuting it by equipping the African, still a typified character, with certain human qualities. William Wilberforce, the famous MP, stated in 1791 that, quote, the state of civilization is in general very imperfect, their notions of morality extremely rude, the power of their governments ill-defined, unquote. Africans, under favorable circumstances, could be turned into Europeans, at least into some form of European-type man. The reiteration of the stereotypical images of Africans was a necessary step in the justification of the African slave trade, as the forging of this image confirmed the slave's loyalty and submissiveness to the white master, which then qualified them for ascending the ladder of European culturality. So the recurrence of images of blackness is thus a reinforcement of the connotative negativity associated with African slaves. In the theatre, quote, the repetition of a trope or a gesture or conventional plot comforts the audience by presenting what is familiar. Theoretical performance is by definition a masquerade, which by its very nature negates essentialist notions of reality. The white actor in blackface may speak and act in ways that reinforce stereotypes about black people, but because he's not the thing he pretends to be, and the audience knows it, his gestures and attitudes suggest that his identity is adopted, not inherited, unquote. So even if a theoretical performance negates essentialist notions of reality, the performance and portrayal of the character is still the only reality recipients are confronted with. So the fictive or dramatic reality metamorphoses the character, the African slave, into an image people identify with, a surrogate reality. The emphasis on different images of African characters, different character types, and different behavioral patterns reveals the reality Britons were confronted with, the reality writers created in their depiction of African slaves. So African character types are, quote, projections of imaginations that capitalize on the assumptions, fantasies, fears, and anxieties of England's pale-complexioned audiences, unquote. So besides on evoking the audience's pity, dark complexion as a marker of racial difference could also raise fears. Cypher asserts that while the Royal African Prince excites terror, quote, the crusading poet or novelist must turn to the ordinary Negro for pity. Consequently, the downtrodden ordinary African must be used to signify the wretchedness of the slave, and appeal directly to the pity of the reader. The princely Negro stands in sharp opposition to this miserable fellow slave, unquote. This sentimentalist approach adopted by authors in the characterization of African characters is an integral part of the European-African dichotomy in slavery plays. It's basically not only about humanitarian readers feeling for poor Africans, but about positive and or negative connotations the African character carries at that particular time. That is how ideologically charged the character was. According to Sanchez-Epler, quote, making a black hero involves not only dyeing the traditional figure of the hero to a darker hue, but also separating blackness from the configuration of traits that in the bodily sign of slavery designates the African. According to Sanchez-Epler, making a black hero involves not only dyeing the traditional figure of the hero to a darker hue, but also separating blackness from the configuration of traits that in the bodily grammar of sentimental fiction signals revulsion, unquote. So black as an invariant sign of slavery designates the African as a body incapable of escaping the oppression of the white master, implying the fixation on the subservient nature of Africans. On the other hand, African character also evoked laughter when portrayed by the author as the lustful, inebriated and unreliable slave. For example, in Isaac Bickerstaff's The Padlock from 1768. Vaughan's assertion that, quote, Shakespeare's tragedy, she is talking about Othello, is not about Africanness, but the white man's idea of Africanness, unquote, cunningly encapsulates what the slavery plays of the 18th and early 19th centuries discussed here not only attempted, but successfully accomplished, a deeply entrenched belief in the otherness of African slaves. So representing African characters on stage meant creating cultural realities, and the reiteration of images eventually created a reality based on natural facts. Readers were confronted, or the audience was confronted with racial stereotypes that were to become, or had already become facts, a cultural reality that divided humankind in superior European and inferior African bodies. Now to the third chapter. I hope you haven't fallen asleep. Sorry.
No, not at all.
The third chapter deals with the three plays. The first being McLaren's The Negro Slaves, and the third chapter is entitled "The Slave is Culturally Inferior but Morally Superior." Archibald McLaren's The Negro Slaves, the whole title is The Negro Slaves or The Black Man and Blackbird, was first published in 1799 and was adapted at least once and toured throughout the North for many years. According to Cypher, it is, quote, among the most sensible anti-slavery performances, unquote. He published two versions of the play, the first version of which was performed at the popular Attlees Amphitheatre just south of the Thames at London under the title The Black Man and the Blackbird. Set in the West Indies, the story revolves around the central characters Captain Raccoon, who is the plantation owner, his slave Quaker, with his wife Selah, the merchant Justice, his daughter Phoebe, with her servant Lucy, the Scot McSympathy, and Firmlove. Now what happens? Raccoon is in love with Phoebe, who still loves Firmlove, believed to have been killed by Indians. Quaker and Selah's relationship is menaced by Raccoon's threat the self-sailor to take revenge on Quaker for exposing and publicly denouncing his cowardice and racist pro-slavery attitude. According to Gale, quote, Quaker is an educated and eminently moral slave and thus is continually making his uneducated and unscrupulous master look ridiculous, unquote. McSympathy can be considered the Scot who instructs all the characters, especially Raccoon, in the humanity of the British. When Firm Love eventually appears towards the end of the play, he buys Quaker and Sailor, and by setting them free, voices Great Britain calling a halt to trade in human beings. The Negro slaves, so the play stages the battle between the plantation owner Raccoon's openly contemptuous attitude towards African slaves and Quaker, who, supported by McSympathy and Firm Love's humanitarian aid, serves as the moral stance setting the pattern for the manumission of the slaves in the colonies. Raccoon's utter contempt for Quaker is evident right at the beginning when he muses upon the insolence of the African slave to act like a Christian. That's what he has to say. Quote, Sir, this cursed Quaker of mine has been taught to read and write, thanks to English Tom, who had the folly to instruct him. In short, the savage has the impudence to think, nay, even to speak like a Christian. It was but yesterday I condescended to dispute with him. The parson said he was like to be too hard for me, but I knocked him down. Unquote. So while Quaker is the epitome of the savage slave who as a non-Christian is considered a beast of burden to be treated as the owner pleases, Raccoon and McSympathy embody the two forces at work during abolition, the former representing the planter class and the latter Great Britain's ameliorative approach towards slave. Quote, love and loyalty shall always be our motto, and if we should throw a few grains of humanity in the compound, then never a bit the worse will it taste. I would not exchange my false humanity for all your real barbarity. If it is indispensably necessary to continue them slaves, there is no necessity for using them like beasts. I would advise you to use little of my false humanity, lest your acquaintance should forget your Christian name, and call you beast. Unquote. So Christianity is thus associated with kindness and a feeling of justice towards the poor heathen slaves. Kindness, quote, will excite them to love and gratitude. Severity prompt them to hatred and revenge. Unquote. So if not enemies to Great Britain, McSympathy will promote the happiness of all mankind. And he says, and I quote, I have no valor enough to strike a poor slave any more than I would a bound prisoner. As a true Briton, he will never ask what country if he has an honest heart, white or black or brown or yellow. If he is wronged, I will take his part. Unquote. So what does McLaren do? He instrumentalizes Quaker when denouncing the system of slavery. Quaker claims that it is the British that enslave fellow human beings. He says, quote, your whites, your polished, humane whites have robbed my poor father's nest of all the young and left the old birds to mourn, to droop and die, unquote, and leave them to die on the plantations. So the metaphor of the blackbird's nest that Quaker is accused of having robbed serves as a clarification of his interest. Quaker shows readers that he, quote, knows no such things as interest. My whole life is devoted to the interest of another. I knew the poor things were to be enslaved and I set them at liberty, unquote. So that is why Quaker craves for liberty, as too many of their colour are already slaves, and he also craves for a power that will waft him to the native shore of Guinea. So Maclaren's play establishes the difference between colour and race, and his choice of the subtitle ensures the equivalence of native animal colouring between man and bird, defining it as something not to be washed off. When Raccoon has his revenge on Quaker by threatening to sell Sailor to another master, it's Quaker's willingness to bow to Raccoon's conditions that brings Quaker's virtues to the forefront, being prepared to do anything to save his beloved Sailor. That is what he has to say about it. You have always used me with severity. I have the feelings of a man, though but the complexion of a Negro. But treat me with humanity, and gratitude will form me to your pleasure." Unquote. So Maclaren strikes a balance between the inhumane conditions Quaker and slaves in general suffer from, and the empathy abolitionists in Britain feel for the poor slaves. The fact that Quaker consider slaves to be treated even worse than animals is counterbalanced by McSympathy's promise that, quote, "many able learned men are interested in your welfare, and I hope to see the day that will put you on an equal footing with the rest of your fellow creatures, or at least make your situation more tolerable." Unquote. The sentimental picture of the slave's life in Africa before the arrival of the white slave trader, their transportation to the colonies, their being sold as chattel on the slave market, and their miserable existence alongside white indifference, contrives to portray Quakers embodying the moral authority whose responsibility it is to make people realize the atrocities committed towards fellow human beings, whatever their skin color. When the Indians lurk in the woods ready to attack the plantations, it is Quaker's Christian virtues that convince readers of his superior moral standards. Quote, he's talking about his master, "denies me the benefit of a Christian name, but cannot hinder me from the exercise of Christian virtues. My heart would prompt me to revenge, but I've been taught to read, and the book bids me love my enemies. I'm sorry, I cannot love, but I forgive him." Unquote. So the juxtaposition of Quaker and Captain Raccoon, ridiculed by Phoebe and Lucy when they expose Raccoon's cowardly act of running away from the armed Indians ready to attack, is a clear indication of the author taking sides. So the character of Captain Raccoon is the very model of the ignorant slaveholder who knows more of brutality and battery than mortality and humanity. Gale points out that, quote, "such a drama presents a significant alternative viewpoint regarding the lot of blacks in the West Indies, and by association throughout the known world, the nature of colonial economy in general and plantation economy specifically, and the philosophy of moral sensibility in its application to all of humanity," unquote. So this is only valid in that it sets the tone for plays that feature African slaves and deal with the topic of enslavement. Archibald Maclaren is certainly not the only and not the first one to approach the supposedly disparity between colonizer and colonized in regard to the degree of civilization. It is not the lot of blacks, but the lot of one particular slave that is chosen by playwrights to delineate the relationship between master and slave. So it's not a significant alternative viewpoint, but a cunning plan to single out the fate of a slave of royal birth in most cases, because of the fascination it exerts on British audiences, and thus to use this individual fate to appeal to the moral sensibility of readers. The next play is Joanna Baillie's tragedy Raina. And this particular chapter is entitled "The Grateful Slave, Thankful for the Generosity of the White Master." It was written in 1790, but not published until 1804, and it was never performed on stage. She wrote some 26 plays, of which no more than 7 were actually performed. Even if only few of her plays were performed, her position as Grande Dame of letters during the early and middle decades of the 19th century was secure. Baillie is considered among other female writers of the period, quote, as making a key contribution to one of Romanticism's most urgent projects of cultural renewal, the revival of Britain's national dramatic tradition. Unquote. According to Susan Bennett, quote, she saw drama not in just a local sense, but as a powerful contribution to national identity, unquote. This statement serves as a starting point for the analysis of the play, since even if slavery may not have been a key issue for her, she nevertheless addresses the issue of enslaving human beings in Raina. The story is set in Germany, near the frontier between Poland and Silesia, and recounts the events of Raina, a gallant soldier who has been deprived of his uncle's possessions by the villain Hubert. Count Zetterloo and his followers Bernard and Sebastian talk Rainer into killing Hubert in order to retaliate the dreadful deed. But when Rainer dismisses murder as a sin, Zatterloo promises him that no violent deed will be performed. Hubert is eventually killed in the wood and Zatterloo severely injured. Rainer, who has sought refuge inside a cave from the terrible storm raging outside, is taken prisoner, accused of murder and eventually taken to prison. Hardibrand, who is an old general and friend of Rainer's father, his efforts to prove his innocence fail, as well as the attempts of his betrothed Elizabeth to persuade Zatterloo's mother, that's the Countess Zatterloo, to disclose the identity of the real murderer, her own son. Stricken by guilt, Zatterloo sends a messenger with a pardon to the governor before he dies, and Rainer is saved from being executed. The play features Ohio, a Negro attached to the prison. So the first time Hardibrand bumps into him is at court in Act 3, Scene 2, when he inquires about the keeper of the prison. Ohio is depicted as a bright and cunning slave who hurls accusations at the inhumane treatment of slaves in his witty riposte. And he says, and I quote, "Know you what prince you speak to, saucy knave? I will have thee scorched and flayed, and piecemeal if thou dost call me friend." Unquote. When Ohio overdoes it by sending Hardibrand to the wrong door twice, Hardibrand's anger is aroused. He says, "What," quote, "dost thou jest with me, malicious varlet? I'll beat thee if thou tell me false again." Unquote. Ohio's affirmation that Negroes be very stupid first induces the keeper of the prison to call Ohio cankerworm, black envenomed toad, and pitchy viper, but then suddenly turns the reader's attention to the deplorable conditions Ohio had to suffer from. He was once a prince sold into slavery. Quote, "When but a youth, stolen from his noble parents, he for a slave was sold, and many hardships by sea and land has passed." Unquote. So this is something that keeps keeps turning up in many plays. Injured, he was left there by his former master, but he recovered, and though full proud and sullen at the first, quote, "tamed by the love of wine, which strongly tempts him, he by degrees forgot his princely pride." Unquote. Ohio's noble lineage, the noble savage transported across the Atlantic under abominable conditions, prompt Hardibrand to pity the poor slave. He says, quote, "Of royal line, born to command, and dignified by sufferings and dangers past, which make the meanest man ennobled." Unquote. So this sentimental image of the slave in need of help, this casting a pitying glance at the poor being, is given great emphasis in Act 5, Scene 2, when Ohio surreptitiously tries to steal Rainer's cloak, avenging his fellow enslaved brother's sufferings. Quote, "Thou hast loved Negroes' blood, I warrant thee. Dost sleep? Ah, they will waken thee before long and cut thy head off. They will put thee to rest. They will close thine eyes for thee without thy leave. They will bloat thy white skin for thee, lily face. Come, less harm will I do thee than thy fellows. My sides are cold. A dead man needs no cloak." Quote. Ohio, of course, is caught red-handed, and Rainer also falls into the trap of degrading Ohio. He says, quote, "What whole of the earth hath cast thee up? What thing art thou?" Unquote. But then he tries to console Ohio by offering him the cloak. He says, quote, "Thou art the wretched Negro who serves the prisoners. I have observed thee. I am sorry for thee. Thou art bare enough, and winter is at hand." Unquote. Rainer's empathetic reaction comes as a great surprise to Ohio. He says, and I quote, "Ha! Art thou sorry that the Negro is cold? Where wast thou born, who art so pitiful? I will not take thy cloak, but I will love thee. They shall not cut thy head off. I will kiss thy feet. I will spend my blood for thee." Unquote. So the thankfulness displayed by Ohio, the fact that he is greatly indebted to Rainer, acknowledges the image of the thankful slave who, through an ameliorative treatment, turns into this preconceived notion of the slave as a humble servant of the white master. This is reinforced in the act, in Act 5, Scene 4, when the execution of Rainer is about to take place, but some unknown friend has sawn the scaffold and the executioner falls down and hurts himself. Ohio eventually reveals himself to be the deliverer, providing the following explanation for his deed. Quote, "He, Rainer, offered me his cloak, he pitied me, and I have paid him back." Unquote. Hardybrandt, the embodiment of the benevolent European, expresses his thanks to Ohio, who as a noble prince has saved Rainer's life and therefore deserves to be acculturated. That is, saved from his degenerate state by the cultural superiority of the West. And that's what Hardybrandt has to say. He says, "Ha, well done and well said, my brave black thing. Art thou a prince? In faith, I think thou art. I will take thee home and make a man of thee. No, no," pointing to Rainer. "Here is my son, my heir, my child. All that I have is his. He will reward thee. Thou hast a generous mind, although debased with vile oppression and unmanly scorn." Unquote. And the last play is Maria Edgeworth's The Two Guardians from 1817. And this chapter is entitled The Anglicized Slave. That's what I call the Anglicized Slave, fit for liberty under British guidance. So The Two Guardians, the play is set in London and features St. Albans, who is a young West Indian, who as the heir to a large fortune is assigned a guardian, that is Mr. Onslow or Lady Courtington, one of which his mother, Mrs. St. Albans, is going to choose for him. St. Albans, embodying the true spirit of liberty in England, sets free his loyal slave Quaker, again Quaker, the same name, this time a C instead of a K, and presents him with all the money he has worked for in the West Indies, but not without warning him against spending it on drinking. So while Lady Courtington and Mr. Onslow vie for Mrs. St. Albans' favour in being chosen as her son's guardian, Mrs. Beauchamp, a widow, backs Lady Courtington and Juliana to pay her for the harp lessons she gave Juliana in order to save her poor starving children, but to no avail. The only one to provide a sympathetic ear to her is Quaker, who knows pity. So without her noticing, he slips the purse he got from St. Albans into her basket. When St. Albans falls from the horse, Beauchamp, Courtington and Popkin have wounded on purpose for him to fall off and hurt himself. It is Mrs. Beauchamp that takes care of St. Albans. She heartily thanks Juliana for sticking the little purse with all the money into her basket, which arouses St. Albans' suspicion. In fact, it was Quaker who deposited the purse. St. Albans finally chooses Mrs. Onslow as his guardian. Now, the first time Quaker is mentioned in the play is when Popkin claims that Quaker is in this world to, quote, answer the door for me, unquote. The first assertion is proved wrong, as Quaker is depicted as an ingenious human being who, even if considered by most of the characters in the play as inferior, from the beginning assigns people certain qualities, knowing right from the start who is honest and who is after St. Albans' money. When in Act 1, Scene 3, his master St. Albans manumits him, it is England's clarion call that all slaves are free in England, the author lays particular emphasis on. To the question how he likes England, Quaker replies, quote, "London very fine, massa. Quaker like England very much, massa. Very good country, England. No whip for the slave, nor no slave nowhere." Unquote. St. Albans not only alludes to the famous Mansfield decision in 1772, quote, "No slaves in England. From the moment you touched English ground, Quaker, you ceased to be a slave. You, Quaker, you are as free this moment as I am." Unquote. But he also instills discipline into Quaker by telling him what being free means. Quote, "Now if you stay with me, it's from your choice. You may go when and where you please. You may choose another master." Unquote. Quaker chooses to stay with St. Albans. He says, quote, me will be massa a slave always, unquote. And St. Albans presents him with the money he has earned as a slave. I told you, quote, I told you that if you trusted to me and if you would come to England with me, you should not lose the value of your former labour, unquote. So St. Albans is also at pains to assert that he's left to themselves, that's the slaves, to benefit from this new situation. He says, quote, show me, Quaker, that you are a reasonable being and fit to be free, unquote. So Quaker's thankfulness or forced subjection expressed in the song that follows is actually what the white master is striving for, something Quaker is apt to confirm. And now the song. Quote, freedom, freedom, happy sound, magic land, this British ground. Touch it, slave, and slave be free, this the land of liberty. Indian Obi's wicked art sickens low poor Negro's heart. English Obi makes the slave twice be young and twice be brave. Quick the magic, strong the power, see man changing in an hour. For the day that makes him free, double worth that man shall be. Massa, grateful Quaker, do twice the work of slave for you. Fight for Massa twice as long, love for Massa twice as strong, unquote. So it's the image of the grateful slave praising England as the haven of liberty for the enslaved that is instrumentalized in the meaning the West Indian Obi, folk magic and religious practices. Instead, it is the English Obi that rescues slaves from their cultural and religious ignorance. The moment African slaves are taken care of by Britain, they slowly gain ascendancy in the, what I call, all-white group. For the day that makes him free, double worth that man shall be. Alison Harvey maintains that, quote, Edgeworth's emphasis on the irony that the greatest change Quaker's liberty will effect in him is the increase in his productivity and love for his massa, undermines an easy reading of this song as an expression of her own views or even as a condescending endorsement of Quaker's gratitude, unquote. Quaker, once set free and thus a servant rather than a slave, turns into this man of double worth, a human being equipped with the imperative of British morals and serves as the moral compass in the play, pinning down who can be trusted and who is taking advantage of St. Albans's position or situation. Quaker not only helps Mrs. Beauchamp by providing her with the money she needs for her starving children, but also warns readers against Lady Courtington and Juliana's greediness and Beauchamp, Courtington and Popkin's grand plan to get rid of St. Albans. Quaker reminds them that love is blind. Quote, love, death too. And he also reminds them that St. Albans is, quote, too good, blind good. And that Juliana is just talking rather than acting on Mrs. Beauchamp's predicament. He even claims that he could not love someone like Juliana. Quote, pray you no fall in love with that Miss poor Quaker no can love, unquote. So Quaker's sympathy and compassion for the needy, for the poor people in Britain, is a smart move for readers to identify with slaves who live under inhumane conditions in the colonies and suffer from the harsh treatment of traders and plantation owners. The poor in Britain live under similar conditions, starving and fighting for survival, the only difference being that Africans are placed lowest on the ladder of evolution. Thus, the image readers are confronted with is that Britishness does not only congeal the seventh stage of slaves, but also brings to the fore the noble qualities Britons are known for in the world, the desire for liberty and their empathy towards the needy. When Quaker tells Mrs. Beauchamp that, quote, poor Negro he feels sorrow, he no pity, unquote, she seems to be overwrought by the possibility of a slave pitying her. And she says, quote, he pities me, this poor Negro. That poor Negro touched me more than all the rest. There's good in the world still, and kindness where one least expects it, unquote. Quaker is thus exploited as the epitome of human misery who knows how the white European elite treats non-Europeans. The only consolation Mrs. Beauchamp finds in Quaker's humanity, a moral code St. Albans has instilled into Quaker's mind. So what he does is what his master has taught him to do, that is, to give it well. At the same time, however, Edgeworth does not refrain from tarnishing the image of Quaker as a bright and feeling human being when she lets Popkin exclaim, quote, "Now was he a white man, I would set him down for a knave, but being he is a black, I can't doubt but he is a fool," unquote. When Popkin is trying to trick Quaker out of the money he got from St. Albans, Popkin admits that he, quote, "never saw a fellow so brightened and sharpened in an hour in my life as this little black boy," unquote. Nevertheless, it would be, quote, "odd enough if I, John Popkin, the white, weren't a match anyway for Quaker, the black. A blundering blackamoor blockhead," unquote. Beauchamp Courtington confirms the stereotypical portrayal of Africans when he agrees that Quaker lacks any sense and feeling. Quote, "For there is no managing them blacks, no breeding them to have the sense or memory of a Christian without flogging of it into them. They say, on account they have not the feeling we have," unquote. So when Quaker relates how his master fell off the horse, Juliana calls him as stupid as a post, as he refuses to provide any details concerning his state of health. She eventually reaches the conclusion that he is, quote, "a stupid black. They may say what they will, but I am clear those Negroes are all naturally inferior," unquote. Still, it is Quaker who spoils St. Albans' disillusion that Juliana is really in love with him. Quote, "She no love, she never love like massa," unquote. Mrs. Beauchamp puts it in a nutshell when she claims that, quote, "those who have suffered evil themselves are perhaps the most ready to relieve it in others," unquote. A statement that at first glance does not necessarily bear upon Quaker, but surely is a hint at the fact that he assisted someone who desperately needed help. This is a straightforward message for readers, but after all, only possible after Quaker has been manumitted. So liberty bequeathed by the British upon slaves turns them into valuable members of society. When it is revealed that Quaker helped Mrs. Beauchamp, something he would never have prided himself on, he metamorphoses into what they call, quote, "an excellent creature," unquote. This Juliana is displayed as someone who stands in contrast with this Negro boy. So this final juxtaposition of Juliana representing European greediness and Quaker, the humble slave turned servant, embodying naturalness and the moral authority in the play, can be understood as the cultivation of the image of the thankful slave who, once set free, proves his loyalty to his former and new master in that he behaves righteously superior to the morally degenerated Europeans, resonating the stereotypical view that blacks need to prove their fitness for freedom. Summing up. To think I could design to make those free who were by nature slaves, wretches designed to be their master's dogs and lick their feet. Oronoco's speech from Thomas Southern's Oronoco from 1696 encapsulates the colonizer's attitude towards enslaved Africans. So by distancing Britishness from the otherness of non-Europeans, they, quote, strengthened a sense of Britain's superiority that was based on the principle of inequality, unquote. The attempt of portraying Africans as poor oppressed creatures, indelibly marked as inferior to the white colonizer, as a race to be rescued from their own ignorance and introduced to the unprecedented civilization of Western culture, was an affirmation of their ostensible lack of culture and morality. The continued reiteration of the auto-stereotype of the British as culturally superior and the hetero-stereotype of African slave as in need of being civilized familiarized the British public with the colonial discourse that was to dominate Britain's conduct towards the other. A critical discussion of colonial literature, in particular the images used in plays featuring African slaves written in the 18th and early 19th centuries, is an articulation and re-evaluation of the distancing of us from them from a post-colonial perspective, and can thus be interpreted as resistance to the post-colonial or colonial interpretation of the world. Scrutinizing images of African slaves created by the imperial ideology in the contact zones is, as I said, most essential to understand how they came into being and how they influence, or still influence, modern thinking in terms of national, cultural, ethnic differences. So the actual process of identifying stereotypical images of the other in these plays implies uncovering the foundation of modern stereotypes and cliches that still have a bearing on our attitudes towards other nations and cultures. Archibald MacLaren, in The Negro Slaves or The Black Man and Blackbird, conjures up the image of the morally superior slave Quaker, who instructs Europeans, Britons, in denouncing the system of slavery, as he claims it is the whites that enslave fellow human beings. So being treated as a human being eventually transforms Quaker into a Christian emissary that reminds readers of the cruelty of enslaving Africans and of Britain's great empathy for them. Ohio, in Joanna Baillie's tragedy Rainer, the royal slave of noble lineage, is used to excite sympathy among readers when Rainer takes pity on Ohio, having tried to steal his cloak. The gratefulness displayed towards Rainer acknowledges Ohio's image of the thankful slave who as a loyal servant of the white colonizer depends on the generosity of his white master and thus helps him in his predicament. Maria Edgeworth in The Two Guardians, a play published after the abolition of the slave trade in the British Empire in 1807, misuses the slave Quaker for lavishing praise on Britain's noble qualities of liberty and empathy towards the needy. Quaker is thus portrayed as an ingenuous human being who, once manumitted and given the choice to leave, chooses to stay with his benevolent master. Quaker serves as the moral entity in the play, who is a free slave, stays with his father, supports the poor in England, and exposes the moral corruption of European society. This image of the anglicized slave confirms the loyalty to the colonial master in that the slave proves to be fit for liberty under British guidance. This confirms Baluku's assertion that, quote, the moment that the master claims to recognize his slave's humanity is the same moment that the master begins to articulate a difference from, a superiority to, the slaves. So once slaves have shown their humanity, they still need masters so they can continue to demonstrate their humanity by showing their gratitude in the act of serving. Ultimately, amelioration becomes an argument not for equality, but for paternalism, unquote. But this is exactly the moment the slave is articulated as being different from and inferior to the master, since the master's superiority is redundant in a colonial discourse where this superiority is a given and the inferiority of the African body is repeated continuously to fix the image of the African slave as culturally and also biologically different. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
It's not just you, I'm sure. Right, have we got any questions? Thoughts, comments, while you catch your breath?
Oh yeah.
I wonder if you have any data on how audiences responded to this. You've given us what the playwrights wrote.
Yes.
But how did the audiences respond? Did they take that message or?
Yeah, that's very difficult to find out because the only sources we have is how many plays or how many times the play was performed. You have very little when it comes to audiences' reactions. I mean, if it was played, I don't know, 20 or 25 times per season, it was obviously very successful. Other plays were booed off stage, were performed just once, and obviously they didn't like it. But it's very, very, very difficult to find out. I gave a talk at the conference, and an Irishman told me that it would be very interesting to compare English audiences with Irish audiences, and I tried to go into that direction, but It wasn't very successful because I couldn't find out anything about, well, audiences' reaction. I mean, you have periodicals at that time. That's the Gentleman's Magazine and the Monthly Review, where you have again very little. You have like comments. Okay, this was a very good play, but that's all about it.
They don't go into great detail.
Yes.
Because certainly the London audiences would be used to having black people around the streets who were not
Exactly.
in any way enslaved.
Yes.
And have you heard of Edime?
No.
Right, I only met him last night in the television program, not next.
Okay.
They came into my mind because he was a black African slave on the American colonies,
Okay.
and his master taught him how to play the violin so he could entertain the household,
Yeah.
and he became very proficient. And he was given his freedom, and an English Navy captain found him. He was playing in opera houses.
Okay.
He was that good, a classical violinist, and this American naval captain saw him and had his men press gang him and put him on a ship, and he was enslaved for another 4 years. And for playing at Royal Opera, he was then playing hornpipes for the sailors to dance to. But after 4 years, they set him free in Devon, of all places. And he became completely integrated. This was 18th century, I don't know quite the dates. But he became integrated, and he set up a fabulous reputation as a concert violinist. Greatly celebrated, married a white woman, had brought up 8 children, and really was lionised by British society. And I'm just thinking how those two images of black people would sit aside each other. One speaking broken English, like Quaker, and another very sophisticated and playing, to sort of British society. Whether the audience would think they were watching a stereotype that they didn't recognise.
Difficult again, because what the people or what the audience saw was a white man in blackface or with a mask.
And they wouldn't have it even.
And they didn't have any black characters until this very famous actor, Ira, what was his name again? A very famous actor that played in the United States and went as far as Russia, but he wasn't accepted in Britain, which was also very strange. It's Ira Ulrich, right? That was his name. Well, very difficult. I can only speculate about that. I mean, there were at that time, and we are talking about late 18th century. Historians say there were about 20,000 blacks in London, which is a lot, I think, for that time. And they were used to seeing blacks. Tough. This is tough. I don't know. I guess nobody.
Sorry to ask you that unanswerable question.
Nobody knew. Well, there was no. As I said, they knew little about Africa. Nobody had been there. There had been the certain outposts on the coasts, and all they had was second-hand information as far as the trade was concerned. There were different characters. If you compare those 3 plays to, for example, Isaac Bickerstaff's The Padlock, and this is a very different portrayal of a black character, because we have a black character who is drunk, and when his master arrives, all of a sudden, he's very disrespectful. He talks back to his master and says, "You don't call me slave," and that was supposed to be a very funny character. Okay.
Because it was a shock value, wasn't it? Because a white servant could do the same, but that would be a different kind of humour.
Exactly, yes.
But might it be comparable to things like the stage Irishman and the stage Scotsman at the time?
That's what I was thinking.
Yes.
Where you did have a large London Scots and London Irish population as well, which wouldn't be the same as that portrayed upon the stage.
Yes.
But there's a certain sort of the main, I suppose we say, the dominant discourse is asserting itself by, even though there are these other people around in London, this is reminding, look, they're not, you see them all around, but they're not quite as good as us in that sense.
There's so
it's-
many like the Huguenots, where they tend to ghettoise certain areas.
Yeah, yeah. But it could be sort of like that. The fact that
Well, the Irish character was also a stock character at that time, right?
Yeah.
Because they were also
Lucius
considered
O'Trigger.
to be inferior.
So Lucius O'Trigger. So different.
I've written some notes, and your third play sort of destroyed my notes. But
Okay. Why?
well, it struck me that the first two were Scottish plays rather than English plays. And Clara was a Scotsman, and I know you said it was first performed in London, but I'm fairly sure there was an Edinburgh version before the London one. And I have no. I tried to. I was doing a little googling when you were speaking.
Yeah, okay.
I tried to find that because it's stuck in the back of my mind. I'm fairly certain there's an Edinburgh production just before it went to London, just before it went to Westminster. But McLaren's obviously a Scotsman who wrote this. And he's also got the sympathetic Scottish character. He's not an English character, he's a Scottish
Exactly.
character.
Yes.
And then Bailey, of course, is Scottish. It made me think of how they're too late for the Enlightenment, but they're still the product of people like Hutcheson and Smith and their ideas of sympathy, and how we're sympathetic not just to our own but to everyone out there, and that's sort of how some of those notions and some of the anti-slavery stuff started out as well. It's connected to that. And then you threw an English play out, and I thought, and you were talking about Edgeworth, I was struck with how you're talking about that it seemed a very English version of Liberty, and the song is about it's a British song, but it's all about England. It's an English version of Britain, not a Scottish version of Britain. And of course, the sympathy Enlightenment thing is very much a Scottish line of philosophical thought, not an English one. So that then ruined my little sympathy. But then you did talk about how in the Edgeworth play, it was the slave himself who showed sympathy as well. And you actually used the word sympathy and
Yes.
So I thought it fitted in quite nicely with those three there. That there might be some mileage in the Scottishness of it.
So Maria actually was English.
She's Irish, isn't she?
Yes.
Well, she's Irish, isn't she?
Yes.
She's one of those.
Yes.
Yes, she's an Irish woman.
So there might be something in that.
And then
still the Scottish.
the edges of Four Nations and stuff. Yeah.
The other, I had an extra question as well. You know, Southern's adaptation of Orinoco,
Yes.
which is way more popular than the novel itself ever was. How well was that performed in the period? Is that still being performed, or had that sort of gone out of fashion by the late 18th century? I know in the mid 18th century it's still there, but
As far as I remember, it was very popular at that time. I would have to double check, but I guess it was like between 15 and 20 performances per season in the first 2 years. But I'm not too sure, but I would have to check. That is also that is the first part of my postdoctoral thesis, but I don't remember exactly how popular it was, but I know it was very popular. And there were 2 other adaptations by gentlemen at Hawksworth. Hawksworth, not that popular, they didn't like it, but then the Francis Gentleman version again, because that was 1787 and in line with the discourse of the abolitionists, and that might be a reason why it was so popular at that time. But I can check and I'll let you know.
Any questions out there in the network? We're looking at you, Jim.
Yes. I had a question that builds on Janet's first question, and again to do with reception, but more about the extent to which these plays either influenced the actual political debate about slavery and abolition, or the extent to which they might have reflected in their content aspects of that debate. I just wonder if there's any way of mapping the interrelation between the plays and the political debate, and what sort of dynamic is going on there.
Thank you for the question. Another tough one. It's interesting that most writers, whether that's novelists, whether that's poets, whether that's playwrights,
they all, some of them write about the issue of the slave trade and slavery, right? You have many people writing about that. That includes William Cooper, that includes the big abolitionist, that is Wilberforce, others like Samuel Taylor Coleridge that write about the slave trade. The interesting thing about it is that first, if they are against it, it's against the slave trade. They never attempted to talk against or to argue against slavery in general, because they said first we have to abolish the slave trade, and then slavery is a different thing. Okay, good. Even if they were against the slave trade, and that includes also Wilberforce, which surprised me when I first read about, or when I first came across that particular quote. Even if they were against the slave trade, they had a sort of an ameliorative attitude towards the slave trade, towards slavery, because they were of the opinion that abolishing the slave trade or abolishing slavery was a good thing, but they were not fit for freedom. So that they needed assistance or guidance after being set free. And that struck me as being very weird, because how can you petition for the abolition of the slave trade? How can you work for so many years in the parliament and not believing in the fact that the Africans were fellow human beings? I mean, they believed that they were human beings, but they believed that they were not fit for freedom. And after abolishing slavery in 1834, they still had a period of 6 years of a sort of apprenticeship that ended then that ended in 1838. That was, after 4 years. How could you believe that they were not equal and call yourself an abolitionist? And that's what many of the writers did at that time. They said the slave trade is a bad thing, and how can we tear those people from Africa, transport them to the colonies, and they have to work on the plantations under inhumane conditions. That is a bad thing. But nobody argued for their equality. They all, as I said, had this benevolistic attitude towards slaves. They said, well, it's a bad thing, but we have to guide them towards their freedom. So nobody dared to speak out and say, okay, let's abolish the slave trade. Nobody did that. And that includes Wilberforce.
But that's you looking at it from a 21st century perspective. They wouldn't have been able to do that from their perspective and their knowledge.
True, yes. I agree.
And I think it's a very valid point.
Yes.
It's a good question to ask, but I don't think it was within their ken, within their understanding or their ability to do that, given how you exactly described how they perceived them as it was a paternalistic thing.
Yes.
It was like they were children, they needed to be brought up.
Yes, exactly, the white man's burden, yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But that is very tricky. I often get questions from my students, like when we talk about, for example, Conrad's Heart of Darkness, they say, well, he was a child of his time. So he just wrote what everybody thought was, was correct, with that Africans were inferior, that the whites had justified the conquest and the invasion.
Mm-hmm. It's the same.
I mean, it's the same thing, but
it's the same with gay
and if Achebe calls him a bloody racist, other people say no, he was a child of his time. And I don't think that this is a very good approach. Of course, he was a child of his time, but the whole portrayal of Africa in Heart of Darkness is racist, even from an 1899 perspective.
Well, that's you can argue that. But I'm also thinking about gay rights and so on, and to talk about, homophobia in the way that we understand it now in relation to certain things. And I think it's just about setting your parameters, isn't it? And your definition and your terms.
Yeah, true.
That you're absolutely right. It was racism, but it's a racism that's understood in a different way to the way it is now.
Yes, of course.
And that's about epistemologies, isn't it? And the growth of knowledge and the expansion of knowledge.
I was wondering, it's quite funny how the question I was thinking of to begin with the idea of paternalism and the apprenticeship system was answered quite well. The other idea I thought of was that, say, in the Negro Slave, the idea of Guinea and shaping, I suppose, well, it's probably not something that was, I might be wrong, but much something that doesn't seem to be investigated too much by McLaren, but the idea of a diaspora and a homeland for the slaves seems to crop up under the radar somewhat. Guinea being somewhere that many slaves kind of idealised as a homeland, even if they'd never been to it.
Okay.
The other thing I was thinking is that, as you said, the argument of emancipation and abolition shaped and then became shaped by the rhetoric of these plays. Was there anything along the lines of the Columbo's rebellious states, slaves that gained strength in? Were they depicted in any form?
Oh yes, there is. I mean, I have a colleague at Innsbruck University that deals with that particular topic. I mean, I'm not an expert, but there is, yes. We have different reports that deal with the famous rebellions in Jamaica, for example, that deal with Toussaint Louverture. That is also a very prominent figure in that particular context. You also have all the slave narratives that deal with that particular topic, whether that's Equiano or who's the other one? People like Wedderburn. People like Sancho that deal with that, with the perspective of the slaves after being freed, but also with this rebellious act of
gaining strength.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
An example of that would be McCooney Smith, James McCooney, first black doctor, educated in Glasgow.
Okay.
He wrote plays. Like The Washerwoman.
Okay, I don't know that.
Yeah, he was in New York Emancipation Society.
Okay.
And he was, I suppose, a character that argued for women's rights as well at the same time.
Okay.
And equality in general, not just freedom of slaves, because he was born free and he was in the New York Free State.
Okay. Well, there's another one. That's she's considered the first Black American poet, that Phyllis Wheatley. I don't know whether you have heard of her. And she was also in one of her poems. She also deals with that with the image of Africans at that time. And the interesting fact is that she I don't remember the date, but she published a collection of poems, and she had to appear before a committee of white men in Boston, because they didn't believe that a black girl or black woman could write poetry. She had to answer different questions because they didn't believe that she was fluent, in Latin, and I guess it was Latin, that she was fluent in. Yes.
Oh, look at me.
These are allergies, sorry.
One very sort of odd question. A couple of odd questions. The main slave in the first play, the Negro slave, what was his name again?
Quaker.
Quaker.
Yes. So the first one is called Quaker, and then the
third
third one is
called
Quaker.
How's it spelled?
It's Q-U-A-K-O.
And then C. The other one was a C.
The first one is with K, and the one in the third place is with C instead of a K.
But it's QU. It's not
Like the
KW.
Quakers.
Yeah, I was thinking. It's just simply because I thought if it was KW, it would be sort of an African origin name, but it's QU.
Yes.
So is there a deliberate link here with the Society of Friends, with the Quakers being?
That seems interesting, but ooh.
I know,
I
it
can't
sounds odd.
Can't answer this question. I don't know.
Because it struck me, it sounded like the two of the characters have names that sound vaguely like Quaker.
And the Quakers always turn up in the abolitionist.
Well,
yes,
the Quakers were driving the abolition.
That was actually the core group of the first.
Yeah.
Tough question. I don't know.
We're good at them.
I don't know. Sorry, I have to.
I suppose you just got a whole stream of signification there in relation to the name, don't you?
Yeah, it's just the name struck me.
Particularly in the first play, where they all seem to have very sort of speaking names.
Yes,
because there is a case there with that period.
Absolutely.
It could also be that they will make you quake with fear, because you talked about the fear element.
Yes.
And that notion of possession. I don't know. You could take it into the Gothic realms as well, couldn't you?
Okay.
It just struck me as odd.
Well, I once talked to historians in where was that? New Orleans, and we talked about a play called Art and Nature, a very early play, and that play features a character called Julio. It's Julio, okay, and the only information you have about him is that he is a native from the woods, from the American woods. And there is nothing more. So you don't know whether that's is that the North American woods or is that more the South American woods? And we were discussing what kind of name that is. Is it Julio or Julio or is that a Spanish name or is that an American name? It's very difficult when it comes to these plays because there is nothing. You don't have information about much information about the play, when it was performed, about the author. It's very, very little.
And you're still at the printer's mercy for spellings as well.
Yes.
It's not necessarily an intentional thing.
Exactly.
They could have just run out of Q's or K's and put a C in because they haven't got anything else left.
And he's also this moral stands in the play, and he's as I said morally superior to all the other characters. They listen to him, but they in the end they just push him aside and say, well, we the Europeans are superior, you are the inferior character. And this is 16 something. It's a very, very early play, but very interesting. But that's the only information you have. You know his name, that he's from the American woods, and he's a slave in Britain. That's what you have. But he says, I come from the woods. I don't need any money. The whole European society is corrupt. What do you make of that? You know, he criticizes this Europeanness. So you would suppose that this particular slave is superior or is considered superior. And he isn't. I mean, he can say what he thinks. The playwright allows him to say what he thinks. But then in the end, this is all, he's a slave. So why should we listen to a slave? And what would make the audience? How would the audience react to something like that?
So it functions kind of like a late Elizabethan fool, an early Jacobin fool, who speaks truth but nobody listens to him because he's only a fool.
Yeah.
I guess they would have to have that narrative closure, because otherwise you'd be really upsetting the status quo, wouldn't you? You'd be upsetting your audience.
And the Lord
Causing
Chamberlain.
insurrection.
You'd be upsetting the Lord Chamberlain as well, which
Yeah.
you really don't want to do.
So in a way, it's quite rebellious, but contained rebellion.
Yes.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
On which note?
That's
To
a
think the
lovely-
piece
I
is
think
back.
that's a closing statement. Should we leave it at that? Thank you very much again for answering our
Thank you for turning up.
difficult questions as well.
Yeah.
Thank
Becky
you.
and Lynn, bye, if you're still there.
Hello.
Are they still there?
And thank you, Jim.
Jim's vanishing.
Bye.
Hi, thank you very much.
There. Oh, God.